In this lesson, we are going to be looking at the concept of absolute value. So this is going to serve as a relatively introductory lesson. So you'll get an overview of what absolute value is and how we kind of deal with those problems involving absolute value. So when we discuss absolute value, what we're talking about is essentially just a quantity that doesn't really have a value being positive or negative so much. We're just looking at, for instance, like a distance. So you might think about, the distance between like displacement and distance, where displacement is, how far you've moved relative to where you started versus distance just being how far you've traveled together. So with absolute value, again, we're not really concerned with the direction of the movement. We're just concerned with what was the movement, right? So for instance, on this number line here, we have two values, one at positive 8 and one at negative 8. Now, of course, they have different, values, but their absolute value is how far away are they from 0. So in this case, this is 8 units to the right, but it's 8 units away from 0. This value here is 8 units to the left, but it's still 8 away from 0. So ultimately, they have the same value. So the absolute value from 0 is considered just that value of 8. Okay? So in general, the definition of absolute value has kind of what we call like a piecewise definition, where we're saying that the absolute value of a number is one of two things. It's the same number if that value is bigger than 0, or equal to 0. So if it's positive, then it's just the same number. However, if the value that's inside is negative, what you're going to be saying is that, well, if it's negative on the inside, you're going to multiply it by -1, which will ultimately make it positive. So for example, if we take the absolute value of 4, well, this fits case 1 here, in which the value that's inside the 4 is positive. Therefore, the answer is just the exact same thing that it was. So the absolute value of 4 is just 4. However, if we look at the absolute value of -7, this fits case 2. The value that's inside the absolute value signs is a negative, right? So since a is less than 0, then our answer is negative a. So it's -7, right? So it's been multiplied by -1, and that ultimately turns it into 7. So the basics of it are that if the value is positive, keep it positive. If the value is negative, make it positive, right? Because absolute value will only ever give us positive answers, okay? So that's ideally the definition that we're going to use here. So again, same kind of thing here. Evaluate the following. So here we have the absolute value of 3. Well, since the value of a is already positive, we keep it as the exact same thing, so it remains as positive 3. And this is the exact same example again. The absolute value of -7, since the value inside the absolute value signs is negative, we make it negative, and -7 is just 7. Okay? And again, we can then use absolute values to try and order numbers, right? So as we can see here, some of these terms have absolute value signs, some of them don't. Right? So in this case, this absolute value of -6.5, well, that, since the inside is negative, we would multiply it by -1 and make it positive. 5 is just obviously 5. The absolute value of 4.75 is just going to be 4.75, because when the number inside the absolute value signs is positive, we keep it the same. -3.4, there's no absolute value signs around that, so it's just going to stay as our -3.4. The absolute value of -12/5, since the number inside the absolute value signs is negative, we will then make it positive. So it will be 12/5, or 2.4 if you'd like, right? If you're wanting to put everything in decimals. Then we would have, the next one on the list was -0.1, the absolute value of -0.1. So since the value inside the absolute value signs is negative, we would make it positive, so it would become positive 0.1. And then we have just a regular -0.01, so that would stay the same. There's no absolute value signs there. And the absolute value of 2.5, since what's inside of it is negative, we will then multiply it by -1, make it positive, and it'll become positive 2.5, or 2.5 if you'd like. Right? So then if we wanted to order them from least to greatest, since some of those negative values didn't have absolute value signs, they remain negative. So our least value here is this -3.4. All right, so if we're going to come up with this list from least to greatest, our least value is negative 3.4. Then our other negative value is here at negative 0.01. Again, it had no absolute value sign, so it remained negative. Then we go into our smallest possible numbers, which was the 0.1 here. But when we're listing our numbers, we should go back and list them the way that they were given to us originally. So we'll just list it as the absolute value of negative 0.1. Right. After that, our next smallest value is this 2.4, the negative 12 fifths, the absolute value of negative 12 fifths. So that would be our next value. Then it's our 2.5 here, which translated into the negative 2.5, the absolute value of negative 2.5. Next would be just the 5. After that, oh, sorry, I missed one. It would have been the absolute value of 4.75. My apologies. So that one would have been first. Then it would have been the 5. And then finally, the 6.5 here, which originally was written as negative 6, absolute value of negative 6.5. Right? So this is now our list from least to greatest. Right, so again, you're just taking the values. If there's an absolute value sign around it, if it's negative, you make it positive. If there's an absolute value sign around a positive number, it just remains a positive number. If there's no absolute value signs, they just remain the same. All right, so that then leads us to doing some operations involving absolute value. So again, you should be able to see here that the absolute value signs are just these straight up and down vertical bars on either side of the number. You are going to treat those with the same importance as brackets in terms of order of operation. You will do them first. So if you've got something inside absolute value signs, evaluate what's in there first and then do the necessary requirements later, whether that's addition or multiplication or subtraction. Okay? So in this first one here, we have the absolute value of 4 minus the absolute value of negative 6. Okay? So the absolute value of 4 is just 4. The absolute value of negative 6 is 6, and I'm subtracting these, so ultimately my answer is negative 2. So just because there's absolute values in the expression doesn't mean that the overall answer still can't be negative. Okay? But just make sure you're evaluating those absolute values before you do the operation connecting them. So in the second example, we have 5 minus 3 times the absolute value of 2 minus 7, right? So that multiplication of the 3 is implied, just like if it was brackets instead of those absolute value signs. So once again, we're going to do what's inside the absolute value signs first. So what is 2 minus 7? Well, 2 minus 7 would be negative 5. But then we're going to evaluate the absolute value of negative 5 to be positive 5. So that then becomes 3 times 5. So what we have is now 5 minus 15, which overall gives me an answer of negative 10. Okay? In our third example, we have absolute value of negative 2, bracket 5 minus 7 squared, plus 6, and the absolute value. Right, so again, the entire thing is inside those absolute value signs, so now we're just going to have to go inside and then again do orders of operation. So within that overall absolute value, we would need to do those brackets in there first, which is the 5 minus 7, so it would be negative 2. 5 minus 7 is negative 2 again, squared plus 6. Right, so after brackets, we would do exponents, so we would take that negative 2 and square it. So this other negative 2 is out front. Negative 2 squared becomes a positive 4. Plus 6, and then multiplication comes before addition in our order of operations. So negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. Negative 8 plus 6 is negative 2. And ultimately, the answer is the absolute value of that, which is 2. Okay? So because that entire expression was in the absolute value signs, that would mean that our answer would have to be positive at the end. Right? Whereas in those other examples in A and B, there were parts of the expression that involved absolute value, but overall our answer still was negative. All right, so we're just going to finish up here just by looking at a word problem example. So this one talks about stock markets and the change in stock value. So in stock markets, individual stock and bond values fluctuate a great deal, especially when the markets are volatile, right? So when they're changing a lot. A particular stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange, the TSX, opened the month at $13.55 per share. It dropped to $12.70 increase to $14.05, and then close the month at $13.85. Determine the total change in the value of this stock for the month. This total shows how active the stock was that month. So there's two different things. There's the net change, right, which is overall, how did it change from the beginning to the end, right? So we could say, well, it finished the month, right? So it's like its final value minus what its initial value was is the overall change, right? So it finished the month at $13.85. It started the month at $13.55. So its net change was a change in a positive 30 cents. Right? So overall, in the month, it changed by 30 cents. But what we're interested in is the total change, right? Showing how active the stock was that month. So it's not fair to just look at the net change from the beginning of the month to the end of the month, because if the stock is continually going up and down, you want to know how much that's moving so that you can understand, well, is this something that's reliable? Should I bank on it? Is it safe, or is it more risky, right? The more it's going to move and change, the more risky it would be. So when we're looking at total change, what we need to do is look at the sum of all of the differences, right? So our total change would involve, okay, well, what's the difference with the first change? Right, so always going from the final to the one before. So in that first change, it went from $13.50 to $12.70. So I'm going to take what it ended at, $13.55 to $12.70. I'm going to take what it ended at and subtract the original. And because I'm just looking for the total amount, I don't want the positives and the negatives to cancel themselves out. I just want to know all of those as positive values. So I'm going to take the absolute value of each of these values, right? Each of these changes. So the first change goes $13.55 to $12.70, so where I ended versus where I started, doing that subtraction. Now I'm going to add the next change, so then it went from $12.70 to $14.05, so where it ended was $14.05, and where it started from that section was $12.70. Okay. Then I'm going to add the next change, and the next change was when it went from $14.05 to $13.85. So again, I'm going to add in where it ended at $13.85 minus where it started at $14.05. Right? So by taking the absolute value of each of these changes, I'm only going to deal with positive values, which gives me the total amount that it moved. It doesn't matter what direction it moved, I just want to know how much was it moving. So in that first one, the $12.70 minus the $13.55 gives me the absolute value of negative 0.85, so it moved 85 cents in that first change. In the next one, it was $14.05 minus $12.70, and that gives me $1.35. Right, so it moved $1.35. And then in this final one, we went from $13.85 to we went from $14.05 to $13.85, but that difference there is down 20 cents. Right? And again, because we're interested in the total change, not the direction, not the net change from beginning to end, the total amount that it moved going back and forth, we're going to take the absolute value of all those things. So we're just going to turn that into a positive 85. We're going to leave that as a positive $1.35. We're going to turn that negative 0.2 into a positive 0.2. And we add them all up. So 0.85 plus 1.35 plus 0.2. And in total, we get 240. And that would be in dollars. So the total change of the stock was $2.40 in the month, right? So in the month, the stock had a total change of $2.40. Right? So that's how much it moved. Okay, so oftentimes if you're looking at just, let's say, like distance travel, it doesn't matter whether you're going forward or backwards, right? You're just looking at how much you travel and adding it all up to find the total distance, and this is like the total change. Okay, so again, that's that big difference, is when we're only interested in positive values, we'll want to take the absolute value of things. Okay, and that's just our introduction to what absolute value is. Okay, and then these are the questions that you should be working on to try and get yourself familiar with dealing with absolute value.